The hall was absolutely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence you get before a celebration. Not the held breath silence of anticipation. This was the silence of a crowd watching something break and not knowing whether to gasp or laugh. A boy stood alone in the center of a massive stone chamber, his hand pressed flat against a crystal pillar that rose from the floor like a frozen blue flame. Around him, hundreds of eyes watched. Students in pressed uniforms, professors in layered robes, officials from the kingdom's ranking bureau with their gold-tipped quills and their leather ledgers. Every single one of them waiting for the crystal to light up. It did not light up. The boy's jaw tightened. His fingers pressed harder against the surface, and you could see the tendons in his hands standing out like cables pulled too tight. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and controlled. He was trying. Anyone watching could see he was trying, and it made the silence worse, somehow, because everyone already knew what the result would be. Nothing happened. A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite laughter, something crueler than laughter, actually. The sound of people exhaling through their noses and turning to their neighbors to confirm what they already suspected. That this boy, this 17-year-old with the Ashvael name embroidered on his collar, was exactly what the rumors had said he was. A failure, a dead end, a walking embarrassment to one of the most respected bloodlines in Aldenmore. The crystal returned to its cold, unlit state. The boy lifted his hand away from its surface and stood there, not moving for a moment, staring at the floor. What nobody in that room knew, not the professors, not the officials, not the students whispering behind cupped hands, was that something had just happened inside that boy that had not happened in 400 years of recorded history. Something had moved beneath the surface of his body like a fault line cracking deep underground. Something ancient and enormous had stirred, turned over, and gone back to sleep. And when it woke up for real, absolutely nothing in that kingdom would ever be the same again. This is the story of Kairen Ashvael, the boy who failed his awakening 3 times, the boy who enrolled in Ironvale Academy as a charity case. The boy every student placed at the bottom of every ranking board. The boy who, when the truth about his bloodline finally surfaced, became the thing that every major faction in Aldenmore spent sleepless nights trying to either recruit or destroy. This is the story of a triple awakening, and we are just getting started. Before we get into who Kairen is and what exactly went wrong at that ceremony, you need to understand the world he grew up in, because none of what happens to him makes any sense unless you understand the rules that every person in Aldenmore lives and dies by. In Aldenmore, a kingdom that stretches from the frost-capped mountains of the Veyrath Range all the way south to the golden coast of the Ember Sea, your entire life is determined by one moment, one single ceremony. You stand before a Revelstone, you press your hand against it, and it reads the energy inside your body and assigns you a class. The classes are not random. The Revelstone does not guess. It reaches into the deepest layer of your biological and spiritual composition and pulls out what was already there, dormant, waiting. Warriors with high physical resonance get marked as berserkers or knights. People with strong mana channels running through their internal pathways get marked as mages of varying ranks. Those with unusual affinity for chemical and biological transformation, a rarer gift by far, get assigned as alchemists. There are dozens of subclassifications within those broad categories, and your subclassification determines where you can study, what guilds will accept you, and ultimately, what ceiling the world has decided to put over your life. In theory, the Revelstone never fails. In theory, it always finds something. In practice, some people press their hand against the surface, and the crystal reads nothing, because there is genuinely nothing latent inside them. They are called voids. It happens roughly once in every 300 ceremonies. When it does, it is devastating in a quiet and permanent way. Voids are not punished. They are simply left behind. The world moves on around them, structured and ranked and climbing, and they stand at the base of the steps with no way up. Kairen Ashvael had triggered a void reading 3 times. The first time, everyone assumed it was equipment error. The Revelstone in his home province was older, somewhat degraded. His parents arranged for a second ceremony at the regional capital. The second time, the stone at the regional capital also returned nothing. His mother cried quietly that night while his father stood with his back to the room and said nothing for a very long time. The third time was the one we watched at the beginning of this story. The grand ceremony at Ironvale, open to all candidates regardless of class, held in the Great Stone Hall where the kingdom's most precise and most powerful Revelstone had sat for 3 centuries without a single recorded malfunction. 3 failures, publicly witnessed, meticulously documented, and yet, here is the thing that made Kairen Ashvael different from any void in recorded history. He was not empty. The Revelstone had not found nothing inside him. What the Revelstone had found was something it genuinely could not parse, something so layered and so structurally dense that its reading mechanism simply could not isolate a single classification to assign. The crystal had not gone dark because Kairen had nothing. It had gone dark because he had too much. But nobody, not the officials with their gold-tipped quills, not the professors with their centuries of training, not his own desperate parents, understood that yet. What they knew was that the stone showed blank 3 times. What they concluded was obvious: void, hopeless, forgotten. Now let us actually talk about who Kairen Ashvael was before the ceremony broke him open. He grew up in the Ashvael estate on the western edge of the kingdom, a property that felt more like a small town than a house. The Ashvael family had produced more high-ranked awakeners per generation than almost any other bloodline in Aldenmoor's history. Berserker commanders who had turned the tide of border wars, Seventh-Circle mages who had reshaped entire landscapes to protect civilian settlements. 3 alchemists over the family's history, which is worth pausing on because alchemists are extraordinarily rare and the kingdom treated each one like a national resource. Kairen grew up surrounded by portraits of exceptional ancestors. He grew up eating meals where the conversation somehow always drifted back to rankings and class achievements and the latest news from the guild circuits. His older sister, Era, had awakened at 16 as a 4th Circle mage and was already being discussed in guild circles as a prodigy. His younger brother, Sel, had just turned 13 and everyone was already whispering that the Revelstone was going to crack. When Sel finally pressed his hand against it, his mana channels were apparently so dense you could feel them from across the room. And then there was Kairen. Quiet, bookish, perpetually arriving at the dinner table with ink on his fingers and dust on his sleeves, because he spent most of his free time in the estate's lower library. Not the impressive upper library with its curated collection of class technique manuals and ranked spell references. The lower library, where nobody went, the old archive of histories and alchemical texts and expedition journals from before the modern ranking system existed. The stuff nobody cared about anymore because it was not immediately useful for scoring high on a classification assessment. His father never said outright that he was worried, but you could tell in the way fathers carry worry without naming it. The way he would look at Kairen a half-second longer than he looked at Era or Sel. The way he would occasionally suggest, carefully and without pressure, that Kairen should spend more time in the mana cultivation garden or run drills with the estate's sparring instructor. Kairen was not resistant to these suggestions. He did the drills. He sat in the cultivation garden. He pressed his hand against the practice stone his father had installed in the east wing and waited for something to stir. The practice stone never responded. What Kairen felt during those sessions was a sensation he had no framework to explain. Not emptiness, something more like standing outside a locked door and hearing an entire city on the other side of it. Something vast and moving. Something that would not respond to his attempts to reach for it in the normal way. He tried the breathing techniques from the mana cultivation texts. Nothing. He tried the body-hardening drills from the Berserker primer. Nothing. He tried the basic transmutation focus exercises from an old alchemist's journal he had found in the lower library. Exercises so archaic, they were not even included in modern training programs anymore. Still nothing. But something about those archaic exercises made the sensation stronger, made it feel like the door was a little thinner. He never told anyone about that. He was not sure they would understand, and he was even less sure they would believe him. Then the third void reading happened, and none of it seemed to matter anymore. Here is something most people do not know about Iron Veil Academy, and it matters for understanding why Kairen ended up there. The Academy had a policy put in place 200 years ago by its sixth headmaster, a man named Orion Das, who apparently had a complicated personal history with the ranking system. The policy stated that any candidate who had completed 3 awakening ceremonies and received indeterminate results, meaning not a confirmed void but genuinely unclear data, was eligible to apply for conditional enrollment. They would attend as an unclassified student. They would not be permitted to enter the main class tracks. They would study generalist theory and historical curriculum, things without any real practical ceiling, and they would have exactly 1 year to demonstrate some form of classifiable ability, or they would be formally discharged. Kairen's third ceremony had returned something, not a classification, not a clean blank void reading either, something the officiating examiner had scribbled in the margin of his report as ambiguous resonance pattern, no assigned class, referral to indeterminate protocol. It was the most bureaucratically passive way of saying, we have genuinely no idea what happened, but we cannot call it nothing. His father found out about the indeterminate protocol after 2 weeks of calling in favors he had been sitting on for years. Kairen found out about it the morning his acceptance letter from Iron Veil arrived. He stared at the letter for a long time. It was not a real acceptance. He knew that. It was a holding pen for people the system did not know what to do with. 1 year. Generalist curriculum. No class track. And at the end of it, if nothing emerged, they would politely remove him and he would join the quiet world of voids and unclassified people who built their lives entirely outside the ranked system. He packed his bags. He said goodbye to Era, who hugged him tight and told him to come back with a classification that shook the whole academy. He said goodbye to Cell, who was too young to fully understand, but old enough to know this was important, and so stood very straight and very serious during the farewell. He said goodbye to his father, who shook his hand and then pulled him into a hug that lasted about 2 seconds too long. And he traveled to Iron Veil. Iron Veil Academy sat on the cliff tops above the Veth River, and the first thing most students felt upon arriving was the sheer vertical weight of the place. The main structure had been built upward rather than outward, towers and halls stacked on each other in ascending layers, each one reserved for progressively higher-ranking students. First years, regardless of class, occupied the lower halls at the base of the cliffs. The elite third years and beyond lived at the top, where on clear days you could apparently see all the way to the coast. Unclassified students did not actually occupy the lower halls with regular first years. They had a separate wing, older, less maintained, tucked against the cliff wall where the stone was damp in winter, and the heating pipes never quite worked at full capacity. There were 9 of them total in the unclassified wing that year. 9 students with ambiguous readings or incomplete ceremonies or unusual circumstances that the Academy's intake process had routed into the indeterminate protocol. 9 people who were not quite failures and not quite students. The Academy gave them a shared common room, a generalist curriculum schedule, and a social position that was, in the unspoken language of Academy hierarchy, somewhere below the groundskeeping staff. The other students were not cruel mostly. They were just indifferent in the specific, efficient way that people are indifferent to things they have already decided are irrelevant. When Kairen walked into the main dining hall on his first morning and looked for a place to sit, he noticed the slight but consistent way students at each table adjusted their positioning to make it clear the seat was taken. Not rudely, just conclusively. He found a table near the back windows with 2 empty seats and sat in one of them. A girl arrived 5 minutes later, looked at him, looked at the other empty seat with the evaluating gaze of someone calculating whether this was her best available option, and sat down. Her name was Yura Elendrath, and she was the single most aggressively organized person Kairen had ever met in his life. She had a color-coded notebook for each generalist subject. She had a written 5-year plan that accounted for multiple outcome scenarios, including the scenario where she was discharged at the end of the year without a classification, which she referred to in her plan simply as the contingency. She introduced herself with her name, her hometown, her indeterminate protocol status, and her intended study focus all in about 11 seconds. She did not ask Kairen anything about himself. She opened her notebook and began reviewing her schedule. He found this unexpectedly extremely relaxing. Over the following weeks, they developed something that was not quite a friendship, but was not quite not a friendship either. They sat at the same table, they compared notes on generalist theory assignments. Yura caught errors in Kairen's mana circulation diagrams with the specific joy of someone who genuinely loves finding errors. And Kairen found passages in the historical text that Yura's speed reading had skipped over, and which turned out to be relevant to her research. The rest of the unclassified wing was a mixed situation. 3 of the 9 were clearly heading toward void classification and knew it, and were in varying stages of processing that reality. 2 were dealing with unusual ceremony circumstances that seemed likely to resolve soon into conventional classifications. 1 was a quiet, enormously tall young man from the northern provinces named Nado, who communicated primarily in single syllables, and who, Kairen noticed, seemed to break doorframes slightly whenever he gripped them, which suggested something in his physical resonance was working just fine regardless of what any Revelstone had said about it. The remaining 2 Kairen kept a cautious distance from because their energy felt erratic in a way he could not quite name. And then there was the ranking board. Every academy in Aldenmore maintained a ranking board for its students. The boards updated monthly based on practical assessments, theoretical examination scores, demonstration scores, and class-specific performance metrics. They were displayed in the main corridor where everyone passed at least twice a day, and they were, functionally, the social skeleton of the entire institution. Unclassified students appeared on a separate board, a smaller one, mounted on the wall of a hallway connecting the dining wing to the storage rooms, which meant almost no one with any social standing ever saw it unless they were getting lost. On this board, Kairen's name appeared at the bottom because it was sorted by assessment performance, and Kairen's generalist theory scores were perfectly adequate but not remarkable. This arrangement suited him just fine, mostly because it meant nobody was paying attention to what he was doing. And what he was doing in every spare hour he could find was reading. The Academy's archival library was not glamorous. It was below the main library, accessible through a narrow staircase that the building maps described as a maintenance corridor, and which smelled permanently of old paper and something slightly mineral that Kairen eventually identified as the specific scent of old. Alchemical compounds absorbed into the shelving wood over centuries of proximity. He was the only person who ever went there. This suited him deeply. What he found in those stacks would take months to fully understand. But the thread that caught him first, the one he kept pulling at night after night while Yura organized her study schedule, and Nado made soft sounds of effort that traveled through the shared wall, was a body of historical research on pre-classification awakening. The records from before the Revelstone system was standardized. The accounts from a period 4 centuries back when awakening was understood differently, when the model of single-class assignment was not yet established, and when the people who theorized about human potential used a completely different vocabulary. Back then, the scholars had not organized human capacity into discrete classes. They had spoken instead of layers, resonance layers. The idea that a person's innate potential existed not as a single note but as a chord, multiple frequencies stacked on top of each other. Most people, they theorized, had one dominant frequency and 1 or 2 very faint harmonics that never developed. Rare individuals had 2 frequencies of comparable strength. And in the old texts, mentioned only twice across the entire archive, in terms that were almost reverent and slightly frightened, there were accounts of people with 3 distinct frequencies of equal and unusual power. The old scholars had called them Triarchs. They had also noted, with what Kairen read as a certain amount of restrained alarm, that the Revelstone system, designed to isolate and read single dominant frequencies, would simply return a null result when faced with a Triarch, because there was no single dominant note to lock onto. Every frequency was as strong as the others. The crystal would attempt to parse it, find the signal too complex to assign, and return darkness. 3 void readings. Kairen sat in the archival library at 2 in the morning, the lamplight orange and close around him, and reread the paragraph containing that information 4 times without blinking. He had not been empty. The stone had found something it could not read, and what it could not read was all 3. He closed the book very carefully. He placed it flat on the table. He put both his palms down on the surface of the table and breathed slowly through his nose for a full minute. Because the alternative was some kind of breakdown, and he was not going to have a breakdown in a maintenance corridor. He did not tell anyone about this discovery. Not yet. Because understanding something in theory and actually being able to do anything with it were completely different things. And Kairen had been in this academy long enough to understand that if he announced a theory about himself without any ability to back it up, the result would be exactly as humiliating as the third Revelstone ceremony. What he needed was proof, which meant what he needed was a way to actually reach whatever was locked inside him. And he now had a direction to look. The old texts mentioned a method, not a clean, systematic method with numbered steps and measurable outcomes. An old method. Rough and intuitive and rooted in a period before the academy system had standardized everything. The scholars had called it resonance separation, and the idea was counterintuitive. Instead of trying to release all of your internal energy at once, which was what every modern cultivation technique encouraged, you learn to feel each layer individually, to hold one still while you reached for the next, to develop the sensitivity to distinguish between frequencies that most people spent their entire lives never knowing existed inside them. The technique required physical exertion combined with a specific meditative state, not the gentle, controlled breathing exercises from the mana cultivation manuals, something older and rawer. The physical component was designed to push the body to genuine exhaustion, because in exhaustion, the conscious effort to control internal energy relaxed and the deeper layers surfaced on their own. Kairen started training, not in any of the Academy's official practice halls. There was a section of the cliff path behind the unclassified wing that was technically Academy property, but clearly had not been maintained in decades. Just a long switchback trail cut into the rock face with a flat platform at the top about 12 meters above the wing's roofline. He started running the path before dawn every morning. Then, on the platform, he would attempt the meditative state from the old texts while his body was still burning from the climb. He failed at this for the first 3 weeks, not in the catastrophic visible way, the kind of quiet, patient failing that happens when you are doing something where the only feedback is absence. He would reach the platform, his legs burning, his breath ragged, and he would press into the meditative state as best he could understand it from the texts. And he would feel nothing. Or he would feel something, but it would be so faint and so brief, he could not be sure it was real. Then, on a morning in the 5th week of his attempt, something changed. He had climbed the path faster than usual because he was angry. He was angry because that morning he had accidentally arrived in the dining hall at the wrong time and walked directly into a cluster of ranked first years who had made a point of being loudly curious about which failure category he belonged to. Not because they were particularly cruel people, because he was categorized as irrelevant, and irrelevant things are often walked through without consideration. He reached the platform furious and out of breath, and when he pressed into the meditative state this time, the anger did something to him. It pushed past the careful, controlled breathing. It bypassed the technique and just went straight down, and he felt it. 3 things: simultaneously distinct and simultaneously impossible to focus on individually, like trying to look at 3 candle flames at the same time while standing equidistant from all of them. One was hot, one was deep and cold in a way that felt structural, like stone or bone. One was sharp and precise and chemical in quality, like the way the archival library smelled, but located inside his own chest. He nearly fell. He caught himself on the stone railing at the edge of the platform and stood there for several minutes, shaking slightly, not from the cold. He had felt them. All 3. He had no idea what to do with them yet, but they were there, exactly as the old text had described. stacked on top of each other like layers of bedrock, each one enormous, each one distinct, each one waiting. He started climbing the path twice daily. Here is the thing about developing a skill that nobody has properly codified in 400 years. There are no instructions for the specific problems you encounter. You are reverse engineering your own nature from ancient descriptions that were written by people who were observing from the outside. The first layer Kairen managed to consistently reach was the hot one. It was not fire exactly, it was more like the difference between a torch and a furnace, something that did not deal in light so much as it dealt in force. Raw, physical amplification. When he managed to channel even a small amount of it, his grip strength approximately doubled, and he could feel it in his jaw and his back and his thighs simultaneously, like every muscle in his body receiving a signal it had been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. The old texts called this kind of energy primordial resonance. It was the foundational frequency of warrior classes. The berserkers, the bone crushers, the blood tempest vanguards that appeared throughout Alden Moore's military history. All of them were drawing from this same bottomless reservoir of physical amplification and battle instinct. In modern terms, this was a barbarian lineage class, the most ancient and arguably the most terrifying classification in the entire system, because it did not require mana channels or careful cultivation. It ran on something older than mana. It ran on the body's own willingness to push past every safety limit it had installed. Kairen, who had spent his whole life being described as bookish and quiet and slight, discovered that he could channel this thing and suddenly feel genuinely dangerous. He did not tell anyone. He was not ready. He needed to understand the other two first, because one explosive display of physical power would get him classified as a low-tier berserker variant and slotted into a track that would not account for what else was inside him. And he was beginning to understand, with a clarity that felt new and somewhat frightening, that settling for partial recognition would be the same as allowing himself to be permanently misread. He needed all three together. The second layer was harder to reach. It required a different state, not physical exhaustion, not raw anger. It required something more like the feeling you get when you have been reading alone for so long that the world outside the book has faded completely, when the only thing real is the information moving through your mind. A focused, near-emptied state of pure cognitive flow. Kairen found this easier in the archival library, which made sense in retrospect. He had been in that state accidentally many times before. He had just never been looking for what it was doing to his internal energy while it happened. The cold, deep frequency was mana, but not the tidy, channel-organized mana that the modern magical classification system was built around. This was mana in a form that felt older and stranger, mana that had pooled in structures inside him that did not match the standard pathway maps in any of the textbooks. His mana channels, he was beginning to suspect, were not channels at all. They were reservoirs, wide, still, enormous reservoirs that had simply been sitting full for his entire life while every Revelstone he had touched tried to find a channel to read and found only still water that did not fit the expected shape. When he accessed this frequency intentionally, the air around him changed quality. Not visually, not yet. But Kairen could feel it, the way certain dense materials change the acoustics of a room just by being present. The air became heavier with potential. Objects near him, he noticed, developed a faint reluctance to move when he was deep in this state, as though the space around him had gained a gentle opinion about the physics of the immediate area. He was, in modern terms, a mage. But whatever rank the Revelstone would have assigned him remained unknown, because the scale of those reservoirs was something he had no reliable way to self-assess. He only knew they were very large. He still told no one. The third layer arrived in a way that surprised him, which, given how the other two had manifested, probably should not have surprised him at all. He was in the archival library 2 months into his training regime, on an evening when the academy above him was buzzing with the preparations for the first major ranking assessment of the year. He had spent the last hour with a 17th century alchemical journal, describing a process that the author called structural sympathy. The idea that certain materials in proximity to a human body with sufficient internal resonance would begin to mirror that resonance, vibrating sympathetically at frequencies that revealed their own compound nature. He had found an old glass vial on the shelf, long empty, the residue of something crystallized to a pale crust at its base. He held it in his hand while reading, absently, because he had developed a habit of holding objects while he read, since it seemed to help him concentrate. The vial began to vibrate, very finely, like a struck tuning fork held against the pad of a finger. He could feel it in his palm. He looked down at it. The crystalline residue at the base had taken on a faint luminescence, pale green and slow pulsing, as though it was responding to something. To him specifically. To something in him that he had barely touched yet, a third presence beneath the hot and the cold deep. Something precise and chemical and endlessly curious about the composition of everything around it. The alchemist's frequency. He sat very still for a long moment while the vial hummed softly in his hand. Then he set it down carefully and pressed both hands flat against the library table and thought about what this meant. 3 confirmed. All 3 real. All 3 accessible in varying degrees depending on what state he brought himself into. He was a Triarch. The word felt enormous in his mind, too large to speak out loud. He thought about the texts that had mentioned the old scholars' tone when they wrote about people like this. Reverent and slightly frightened. He was beginning to understand the frightened part. Because a Triarch, according to everything the old records suggested, was not simply someone with more abilities than average. A Triarch was a convergence point. Someone in whom the 3 foundational frequencies of human classification, physical, magical, and alchemical, had developed simultaneously to full strength. And when those 3 things operated together rather than separately, the way they amplified and interconnected each other was not additive. It was exponential. He sat in the archival library for a very long time. He thought about the ranking board in the maintenance hallway, with his name at the bottom of 9 entries. He thought about the ranked first years in the dining hall who had walked through him like furniture. He thought about his father's face during a 2-second hug that had lasted too long. He made a decision. The first practical assessment of the year at Ironvale Academy was structured in tiers. Classified students competed in class-specific tracks. Unclassified students had a separate, low-stakes assessment in the generalist arena, which was smaller and located away from the main competition ground, and which essentially nobody watched because the results had no impact on the main ranking board. Kairen requested a transfer not from the unclassified track to a class track because that required formal reclassification, which required an official Revelstone reading, which he was not ready to trigger. What he requested, through a very specific provision buried in the Academy handbook that he had found while reading through 3 years of policy archives in the basement of the administrative wing, was Observer Category Challenge status. A provision that technically allowed any enrolled student to request a supervised demonstration in any arena, with results recorded as supplemental and not affecting official track standings. It was a provision designed for students recovering from injuries who wanted to test their readiness without risking their ranked standing. Nobody had ever used it to request access to the main arena from the unclassified wing. The administrative official who processed his request spent a long time looking at the form and then looked up at Karen and then looked back at the form. She stamped it approved because the handbook said she had to and because nothing in the provision specified that the student requesting it needed to be impressive. Just enrolled. Word spread through the academy in about 6 hours, which is how long it takes for something strange and slightly absurd to complete a full circuit through every social cluster in a building of 800 students. An unclassified student had requested a supervised demonstration on the main arena floor during assessment week. Nobody could quite agree on why this was funny and why it was sad simultaneously, but everyone agreed it was something they needed to witness. The arena filled. Kairen arrived on the arena floor to the specific quality of silence that only happens when a large audience is simultaneously curious and secondhand embarrassed. He was in the standard unclassified uniform, which was identical to the regular student uniform except for a small gray stripe on the left sleeve that might as well have been a neon sign reading, "Please do not take this person seriously." The proctor for the demonstration was a third-year assessor named Davik, a broad-shouldered lightning class mage who had the expression of a man who had agreed to oversee this particular event the way you agreed to explain something to a small child, patient and already slightly tired. Standing across the arena floor as Kairen's selected demonstration opponent was Sion Dorak. Sion Dorak was, depending on who you asked, either the most talented first year in recent Academy history or simply the most efficient at appearing to be the most talented first year in recent Academy history. He was a dual-type classification, which alone was exceptional enough to have generated considerable noise at the beginning of the year. Both warrior and mage resonance, one dominant, one strong secondary. He was currently ranked third among all first years. He had heard about Kairen's challenge request the same way everyone else had, and he had volunteered to be the demonstration opponent with the enthusiasm of someone who considered this free ranking points with no genuine contest involved. He was not being cruel about it. He was just applying the rational calculus of someone who had been told his entire life that he was exceptional and had consistently received evidence supporting that conclusion. He stood across the arena with his arms loose at his sides and his expression professionally neutral, the expression of someone about to demonstrate a foregone conclusion without making too large a spectacle of it. Davik ran through the procedural opening. He announced the format, a timed open demonstration with light contact rules, which meant force could be applied, but the objective was to read energy output, rather than to actually damage anyone. He asked both participants if they understood the conditions. Sion nodded. Kairen said yes, and his voice was steady, and something about the steadiness of it made three people in the front row of the audience lean forward slightly. Davik raised his hand and dropped it. Sion moved first. He was fast. Genuinely fast, the kind of speed that a warrior primary gives you when you have been deliberately training it for years. He crossed half the arena floor in less time than it would take to fully blink, and his right hand reached forward to make contact with Karen's chest in a controlled demonstration strike. Karen was not there. He had moved sideways, not with any particular grace or trained technique. The kind of movement that happens when something in your body responds before your conscious mind has finished processing the threat. Because one of the things living inside Karen was very old and extremely good at reading incoming physical force. The hot frequency had been waiting for exactly this kind of input, and it had answered before he consciously told it to. Sion recalibrated immediately. He was genuinely skilled. He reoriented and came in at a different angle. Faster this time, with a secondary mana amplified push that he had clearly intended to reserve for later in the demonstration, but which the first failed contact had prompted him to deploy early. This time, Kairen caught his wrist. One hand, steady. The force of Sion's amplified charge traveled up through his wrist and into Karen's grip, and Karen simply absorbed it. All of it, the full mana-boosted physical impact of a dual-type first-year in offensive motion, and held. The arena went very quiet. Sion stared at the hand on his wrist. He stared at Kairen's face, which was calm and focused, and watching him with the quiet attention of someone reading a very interesting problem. Then he reached inward and pulled something up from his mana reserves, preparing to push hard and break free the way his training had prepared him to break free from unexpected grips. And Kairen's grip changed quality. The cold, deep frequency rose through his arm and into his hand, and the space around the point of contact shifted in a way that made three of the Academy's senior professors, seated in the observation box at the top of the arena, go completely still and then begin reaching for their documentation crystals simultaneously. Sion's mana push hit something it could not move through. Not a barrier, more like trying to push against the surface of a lake that had decided to be a wall. The force simply distributed and stopped. He had never felt a mana field that worked like that. He was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely sure what was happening. Then, Kairen released his wrist, stepped back, and lowered his hand. From his left palm, he held a small glass vial that he had produced from his jacket pocket. The same one from the archival library, cleaned out, and now containing a pale compound he had spent the previous 4 nights synthesizing from materials he had, with remarkable patience and zero budget. Assembled from the Academy supply rooms using a combination of formal permission requests and the specific creative interpretation of inventory policies that only someone who had read every administrative document in the building could have. Managed. He set the vial on the ground between them. The compound inside began to pulse. Pale green. Rhythmically. And the pulse was synchronized exactly with the mana field still present around his hand. Because the compound was alchemically sensitized to that specific mana signature. Because the alchemist's frequency, when applied to compound synthesis, allowed him to build materials that responded to his other 2 frequencies as amplifiers. The demonstration proctor, Davik, stared at the vial. He looked up at Kairen. He looked back at the vial. He said in a very measured tone that was doing a great deal of work to remain professional, "Demonstration suspended for secondary assessment. Please remain on the floor." The senior professors were already moving. What happened in the hour following the demonstration suspension was, by later accounts, extremely unusual from a bureaucratic standpoint. An emergency classification protocol had not been invoked at Iron Vale in 41 years. The last time had been for a student who had developed a rare dual-channel manifestation partway through their first year, an event that required a specialized Revelstone reading using a stabilized crystal rather than the standard assessment stone, and which had required 3 classification officials, 2 senior professors, and the academy headmaster to be present simultaneously. This required more. Kairen sat in a small room adjacent to the arena and waited with the calm of someone who had already worked through the emotional component of this situation somewhere else. At 2 in the morning on a cold cliff platform, over a period of weeks, Yura arrived at some point and sat beside him without comment, her color-coded notebook open on her knee to an empty page, her pen held but not moving. Nato appeared in the doorway at one point, took up approximately the entire doorway, looked at Kairen for a long moment, and then gave one slow, significant nod, which Kairen understood as the most expressive thing Nato had communicated all year. The headmaster of Ironvale Academy arrived in the room, along with 2 classification officials and the academy's head of historical studies. An elderly woman named Pressa Halt, who was carrying, Kairen noticed, a book that he recognized. One of the texts from the archival library, one of the texts he had read very carefully in the early hours of several mornings. She set the book on the table between them and met his eyes with an expression he could not immediately categorize. Something between deep professional excitement and the particular wariness of someone who already knew what was coming. She said, "When did you first access all 3 simultaneously?" Kairen said, "Fully? During the demonstration, just now." She said, "And separately," he told her. "All of it? The cliff path? The archival library? The old texts? The vial?" The months of isolation training with no framework except 4-century-old academic theory. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what a Triarch is?" She said, "Do you understand what comes next?" He said, "Not entirely." She opened the book on the table to a page he had read before, a paragraph about the last confirmed Triarch in Aldenmoor's historical record, a person who had lived 4 centuries ago and who had, according to the accounts, fundamentally changed the balance of power between 3 major factions simply by existing. She said, "There are people in this kingdom who have been monitoring Revelstone anomalies for a very long time, who have been waiting, in some sense, for this reading to appear again. When word of what happened in that arena today reaches them, and it will reach them quickly, they will come here. Some of them will want to protect you. Some of them will want to use you, and 1 or 2 of them will genuinely not be sure which category they fall into." Kairen looked at her. He said, "How long do I have before that happens?" She said, "Perhaps a week, perhaps less." He said, "Then I should use the time." He used the time, 7 days. He barely slept. He spent the mornings on the cliff path, pushing deeper into the primordial resonance than he had yet dared, feeling the hot frequency build in his muscles and bones until he could sustain it without the anger trigger that had first unlocked it. He spent the afternoons in the archival library working through synthesis problems with the alchemist frequency, learning the specific and exquisite feeling of reading a compound at the molecular level without opening his eyes. He spent the evenings practicing the mana reservoir control that his second frequency required, not channeling it the way a standard mage would, but flowing it, releasing it in shapes that corresponded to no existing spell architecture, but which achieved similar outcomes through the sheer pressure of what he was working with. Yura joined him for the library sessions on day 3, having apparently decided that whatever was happening was more interesting than her existing 5-year plan, and that her color-coded system could accommodate the revision. She did not know about the Triarch theory specifically, but she knew about the 3 frequencies from the way Kairen described them, because he trusted her, and because he needed someone to observe from outside while he worked through problems that he had no external frame of reference for. Nato joined the cliff path training on day 4. arriving at the base of the switchback trail before dawn, without explanation, and proceeding to run the path with the effortless efficiency of someone whose physical resonance was considerably less ambiguous than his Revelstone reading had suggested. He did not ask questions, he simply trained alongside. This was, in its way, the most useful thing he could have done. On day 6, the first emissary arrived. She was not from any official guild or ranking bureau. She arrived in a plain traveling cloak and presented identification that the Academy gate staff confirmed was legitimate, but which corresponded to an organization that most people in the Academy administration had only ever encountered in historical footnotes. The Ashenvale Covenant, which was about as old as the Academy itself, and which had operated for most of those centuries as a monitoring body rather than an active one, watching for specific patterns in awakening records, keeping their own archive, waiting for something that almost all of their active membership had assumed they would never see in their lifetimes. She asked to speak with Kairen. The Academy granted the request. Her name was Sarah Morn. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of stillness that either came from enormous discipline or from having encountered enough genuinely dangerous situations that the ordinary ones no longer produced any response. She sat across from Kairen in the same small room he had occupied after the demonstration, and she did not begin with pleasantries. She said, "You have been alone with this for months." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you have not yet experienced the convergence." He said, "Not fully." She said, "When all three frequencies operate simultaneously in the same action, rather than in sequence, what you produce is not additive. You know this from the theoretical literature." He said, "I suspected it." She said, "What you do not know, because the literature does not describe it clearly, is that the convergence is not stable by default. The three frequencies will attempt to dominate each other. The primordial resonance will attempt to overwhelm the mana channels. The mana channels will attempt to redirect the alchemical sensitivity toward pure magical amplification. And the alchemical frequency will attempt to begin analyzing and deconstructing the other two from within, because that is what it does with everything it touches." A pause. She said, "Without stabilization, the convergence produces power and then destroys the person producing it from the inside. This is what happened to 3 of the 4 Triarchs in recorded history. They manifested the convergence and burned themselves out within 2 years. Their bodies could not hold what they were." Kairen sat with this for a moment. He said, "And the 4th?" She said, "Survived. Lived to 87. Left behind a set of documents describing how they achieved stabilization." She reached into her cloak and placed a small sealed case on the table between them. She said, "We have been holding this for 400 years." The documents inside the case were dense and technical, and written in a hand that was clearly that of someone working through problems in real time, rather than writing for a future audience. But Kairen had been reading 4-century-old alchemical journals in a library basement for months, and his brain had developed a specific fluency with exactly this kind of text. The core principle of stabilization was straightforward, even if the practice of it was not. You did not attempt to run all 3 frequencies simultaneously from the same internal point. You distributed them. You built an internal architecture through very specific combined training that gave each frequency a distinct origin point inside the body and a distinct pathway of expression, so that they amplified rather than competed. The primordial resonance anchored in the lower body, in the legs and spine and core. The mana reservoirs distributed through the chest and arms. The alchemical sensitivity concentrated in the hands and fingers and the specific sensory apparatus behind the eyes. When properly distributed, the 3 did not fight. They informed each other. Physical resonance under load drew on mana reserves to sustain itself beyond normal limits. Mana reserves shaped by alchemical sensitivity could be precisely targeted rather than broadly projected. Alchemical synthesis, enhanced by physical resonance, produced compounds that would be chemically impossible by any other means. Each frequency made the other 2 stronger, not in series, simultaneously. The 4th Triarch had called this state the unified resonance. The documents described it as the most dangerous thing a human body could produce, and also, if properly stabilized, the most capable. Kairen spent the 7th day alone in the archival library reading through the documents 4 times. Then he went up to the cliff platform at dusk. and stood at the railing looking out at the Veth River below and began the specific internal architecture work that the documents described. It was slow and it was precise and it was deeply uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the feeling of rearranging the fundamental structure of how your own body worked. He worked until nearly midnight. When he descended back to the unclassified wing, he passed the ranking board in the maintenance corridor. His name at the bottom of 9. He stopped and looked at it for a moment. He thought, not much longer. The official reclassification ceremony was held 8 days after the arena demonstration. This was the Academy following protocol, giving formal structure to something that had already been entirely concluded at the level of reality. Everyone in the building knew what the result would be before the Revelstone's light fully responded to his hand. But the moment itself still mattered. Kairen pressed his palm against the special stabilized classification crystal that had been brought in from the kingdom's primary awakening bureau. He felt the 3 frequencies settle into their distributed positions. The architecture he had spent the last week building, each one clear and separately identifiable and simultaneously present. The crystal did not go dark. It did not glow a single color. The light that came through it was 3 colors simultaneously, overlaid in a combination that the officials present had never seen before, and that produced a shade with no established name, because no established name had been needed until this exact moment. The reading that printed out on the assessment display beside the crystal contained a string of classification codes that required 3 separate registry lookups to identify, because 2 of the 3 individual codes had not appeared on any Iron Veil assessment in living memory, and the third had never appeared at the Academy at all. Primordial Berserker lineage, full-grade primary, Seventh-Reservoir Mage architecture, unrestricted grade, Sovereign Alchemist classification, first confirmed instance in the current era. The administrative official processing the results read through the output twice and then set her quill down. She said, "Reclassification complete." The senior professors in attendance were quiet in the specific way people are quiet when they are processing the implications of something enormous that has just become permanent. Pressa Halt, standing at the back of the room, had her eyes closed. Sarah Morn, permitted to witness as the Ashen Veil Covenant representative, watched Kairen with the expression of someone who had spent a very long time carrying something and had just set it down. Kairen looked at the output display for a long moment. Then he looked up at the room full of officials and professors and observers, and what moved across his face was not arrogance and it was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than either. The expression of someone who has spent months in a maintenance corridor stairwell because it smelled like old paper and nobody else went there, and who has arrived somewhere that could not have been reached any other way. He said, "What happens now?" What happened now was complicated in the way that things always get complicated when the implications of something extend outward in too many directions to track cleanly. The Ashen Veil Covenant made their official request. They wanted Kairen to come with them, not immediately, but to engage with their historical archive and their research into Triarch stabilization techniques. Because 4 centuries of institutional memory was now directly relevant to a living person for the first time in 4 centuries, 2 of the major guilds, the Stormveil Mage Syndicate and the Redbrand Warrior Assembly, submitted formal interest declarations to the Academy within 48 hours, which was fast enough to suggest they had been preparing those declarations for some time. The Kingdom's Ranking Bureau dispatched a certification team to do supplemental assessment on Kairen's individual class ratings, which was standard procedure for any unusual classification result, and which, when completed, produced numbers that 3 of the 5 assessors refused to initial because they did not believe their own instruments. Within the Academy itself, the ranking board in the maintenance corridor was taken down. There was nowhere obvious to put it, given that the classification system it represented had no existing framework for the kind of result it needed to display. This turned out to be a minor but somehow satisfying logistical problem. In the main ranking board in the central corridor, a new entry appeared at the top of the first-year listings, not because anyone had added it through the normal assessment pathway, because the administrative office had run the numbers from the supplemental assessments through the standard ranking algorithm as a formality to see what would happen. And the algorithm had produced a result that required an immediate review of whether the ranking board's display system was physically capable of showing a high enough number. Sion Dorak, who was a genuinely skilled person and who had the self-awareness that genuinely skilled people sometimes develop when they encounter someone who reframes their entire understanding of a scale. Stop by the new entry on the board on the third day after reclassification. He stood there for a while. Then he turned around and found Kairen in the corridor behind him, because Kairen had been headed to the main library, which, now that he was a classified student, he was technically allowed to access. Sion said, "The demonstration." Kairen said, "Yes." Sion said, "You held back." Kairen said, "I was still figuring things out." Sion looked at him for a moment. He said, "I want to train with you." Kairen said, "You would need to commit to a curriculum that has not been formally structured yet. I am building it from historical documents that are partially incomplete. It will be uncomfortable and probably occasionally embarrassing." Sion said, "I ranked third on a board with several hundred students, and the first time I actually ran into something I could not handle, I still had time to think, oh, this is interesting, before it was over. I would like more of that." Kairen thought about this. He said, "Bring someone else, someone physical, not a second mage. I need a broader testing range." Sion thought for approximately 2 seconds and said, "I know someone." That someone turned out to be a second year named Kaal, whose classification was Bone Tempest Berserker, and who, upon being told he was being invited to train with a confirmed Triarch, said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "When do we start?" Yura updated her 5-year plan to include this development. She did not tell Karen what she had written in the updated version, but the way she color-coded the relevant sections suggested it was something she considered significant. Nado, when informed of the training group's formation, arrived at the first session 17 minutes early and had already warmed up. Here is where we have to zoom out for a moment, because what was happening inside Ironvale Academy was one story, and the story that was happening in the wider kingdom was a different and considerably larger one. The Stormvale Mage Syndicate and the Red Brand Warrior Assembly were not the only factions paying attention, they were just the ones who had responded through official channels. There was a third organization, older and considerably less interested in being officially identified, that had been doing something far more specific than simply monitoring anomalous Revelstone readings. For the last 6 years, this organization had been quietly interfering with those readings. The Revelstone at Karen's home province, the one at the regional capital, the one at the grand ceremony in Ironvale. 3 separate instruments, 3 separate occasions, 3 engineered null results. Kairen's awakening had not failed by accident. It had been suppressed. He did not know this yet when he was standing in the training courtyard with Sion and Kael and Yura and Nado, working through the distributed architecture exercises from the 4th Triarch's documents. He did not know it when he was completing his first full unified resonance activation under controlled conditions. And Pressa Halt was watching from a safe distance with her documentation crystal and the expression of someone witnessing. Something they had long suspected was possible, but had never expected to actually see. He found out the way you find out most things that someone has been carefully keeping from you, not dramatically, through a detail that did not fit. Sarah Morn of the Ashenvale Covenant arrived at the Academy 3 weeks after the reclassification, with an expression that was no longer characterized by the quiet relief of having set something down. She sat across from Kairen in the small room adjacent to the arena, and placed a different case on the table than the one she had brought before. This one was heavier. Its contents were documents too, but they were not 4 centuries old. The most recent one was dated 18 months prior. She said, "We have spent 400 years monitoring for a Triarch. We did not spend any of that time considering the possibility that someone else was also monitoring and had decided that a Triarch's emergence at this particular time was not in their interest." He looked at the documents. He said, "How long have you known about this?" She said, "We confirmed it 2 weeks ago. We spent the intervening time verifying the evidence before bringing it to you." He looked up from the documents. He said, 3 years of my family believing I was a void." She said nothing. He said, "My father's face." She said quietly, "Yes." He sat with this for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled with the specific control of someone who has channeled a primordial resonance frequency and knows exactly what he is capable of doing when he is not controlled, and who has chosen control precisely because of that knowledge. He said, "Tell me about the organization." The organization called itself the Iron Seal Compact, which was the kind of name that told you everything you needed to know about how they perceived themselves. They believed they were maintaining the structural integrity of the existing order. The ranking system as it stood was a closed hierarchy with known ceiling points and understood power distributions. A triarch in their analysis represented an uncontrolled variable in that hierarchy, an uncontrolled variable that 4 centuries of history suggested had the potential to fundamentally alter the balance between every major faction in the kingdom. They had not wanted Kairen dead. That would have been too obvious and also too incomplete. A void classification was cleaner. A person classified as void went quiet and stayed quiet, removed by the system's own logic rather than by any external force. What they had not accounted for was the archival library, or more specifically, what they had not accounted for was a bookish 17-year-old who had spent enough time in a basement archive to reach a 4 centuries-old text that described exactly why his Revelstone readings were coming back blank, and who had the specific kind of patient, methodical stubbornness that prefers to understand a problem completely before announcing any conclusion about it. The Iron Seal Compact had a list of contingency responses for the scenario in which their suppression was discovered. These contingencies ranged from discreditation of the evidence through official channels to considerably more direct interventions. They had resources within the ranking bureau. They had an associate in the academy's administrative structure. They had, Sarah Morn told Kairen, with the tone of someone reporting a fact that she found both necessary and distasteful to relay, an interest in having this situation resolved before it became too publicly established to manage quietly. Kairen listened to all of this. He said, "How public is it currently?" She said, "You have been formally classified. The certification team's assessment is on record. 3 guild interest declarations are on record." The reclassification ceremony had approximately 40 witnesses. He said, "That is past the point where quiet resolution is available to them." She said, "Correct, which is why we expect them to escalate to a less quiet approach." A pause. She said, "I want to be transparent with you. The Ashenvale Covenant's interest in protecting you is not entirely selfless. You represent the culmination of 400 years of institutional monitoring. We have a stake in your continuation." He said, "I appreciate the transparency." She said, "What I am also telling you is that the protection we can offer is real and should not be dismissed." He said, "I know." He looked at the documents on the table between them for a moment. He said, "What does escalate look like in practice for an organization like this?" Something that looks procedurally legitimate. A formal contest of the classification results, which they can file through the ranking bureau if they have an associate inside. A challenge that nominates a specific examiner and a specific format designed to produce an outcome they control. He said, "And if I refuse the challenge?" She said, "Then the classification record is placed in contested status, which effectively freezes every practical application of it. Guild memberships, academic standing, anything that requires a confirmed uncontested classification, you would be in limbo indefinitely." He sat with this. He said, "Then I will not refuse it." The formal challenge arrived 11 days later, filed through the Ranking Bureau's contested classification process, citing procedural concerns about the conditions of the reclassification ceremony and requesting a verification assessment under supervised conditions with a designated independent examiner. The designated independent examiner was a man named Colvan Thresh, whose official credentials were immaculate and whose actual relationship with the Iron Seal Compact was buried in 4 layers of institutional affiliations that the Ashenvale Covenant had spent 6 days confirming. The assessment format specified in the challenge was a standard multi-domain practical evaluation, theory component, applied energy demonstration, and a combat assessment against a designated opponent. In practice, for a classification as unusual as Kairen's, this meant a format that had no established precedent and whose specific conditions would be decided by the examiner, which meant Colvin Thresh would design the conditions. Kairen spent the 10 days between the challenge filing and the assessment doing 2 things. He trained with his group harder and with more specific intent than before. Sion, who had remarkable instincts for combat strategy, worked with him on the applied energy demonstration format. pushing him to demonstrate the unified resonance in ways that were impossible to misread as anything other than all three classifications operating simultaneously. Kale, who had a berserker's intuitive understanding of physical resonance management, helped him stress test the architecture under actual combat pressure rather than controlled conditions. Yura researched the contested classification protocol in exhaustive detail and produced a 13-page document on the procedural rights of the subject party during a verification assessment, including a provision Kairen found particularly useful. The subject had the right to designate their own counter-examiner who held equal observational authority. He designated Pressahalt. The second thing he did was write a letter to his father. He had not written home since the reclassification because he was trying to understand what had happened before he put it into words for someone who had carried years of quiet grief about his son being a void. The letter, when he finally wrote it, was not long. He explained factually and without editorializing what had actually happened at each of the three Revelstone ceremonies. He explained what the Iron Seal Compact was and what they had done and how he had found out. He explained that he was going to stand in a formal assessment chamber in 5 days and demonstrate in front of an examiner with compromised loyalties and a counter-examiner with a 4th-century institutional memory and his own accumulated training and however many witnesses showed up, exactly who he was. He sent the letter with the Academy's fastest courier designation and paid for the premium rate out of the access stipend Ironvale had issued him upon reclassification. His father sent a response that arrived the morning of the assessment. It was shorter than Kairen's letter. It said, "We are coming. Do not start without us." He almost smiled. The verification assessment chamber was larger than the arena where the demonstration had taken place, which was probably intentional. Larger spaces produced a more diffuse emotional atmosphere which worked against the kind of intensity and clarity that an unusual demonstration required. Colvin Thresh had specified the chamber with the understanding that he controlled the physical environment of the assessment. What he had not accounted for was the audience. The Academy's attendance policy for formal verification assessments was technically unrestricted. Any enrolled student or faculty member could observe. Pressahalt had not restricted attendance. Neither had the ranking bureau officials who had set up the procedural documentation. By the time the assessment began, every available standing position in the chamber was occupied. Kairen arrived and saw his parents in the 4th row. His father was sitting very straight, his hands on his knees, watching the chamber floor with the focused attention of someone who is ready for something rather than afraid of it. His mother was beside him, Era was on the other side, and the way she looked at Kairen when he walked in was the way she had looked at him when she told him to come back with the classification that shook the Academy. She had been joking then. She was not joking now. Sel, 13 years old and apparently too stubborn to be left at home, was sitting beside Era and already making the expression that 13-year-olds make when they are trying very hard to appear mature and are mostly succeeding. Colvin Thresh opened the formal proceedings with the kind of procedural precision that people use when they want the record to show they followed every rule while they were doing whatever they had planned to do regardless. He walked through the theory component first, a series of questions designed for standard individual class assessment that had been technically adapted to multi-class format, but which Pressahalt had flagged in writing. In the procedural notes as insufficient for a Triarch classification, given that none of the standard theoretical frameworks addressed convergence resonance architecture, Kairen answered every question and then answered 3 additional questions that were not on the prepared list and which addressed the insufficiency directly because Pressahalt had asked them as the counter-examiner and because the procedural protocol gave her equal authority to direct a theory component. Thresh moved to the applied energy demonstration and specified a format that separated the 3 classification domains and assessed them individually, each one separately. No cross-application permitted. Pressahalt noted, again in writing, that this format could not produce a valid verification of a Triarch classification because the specific and unique nature of a Triarch resided precisely in the simultaneous multi-domain operation. Assessing each frequency separately would only confirm that each one was present, which was already on record, not that they operated as a coherent, unified system, which was the actual substance of the classification. The procedural challenge on format took 40 minutes to resolve. It resolved in Kairen's favor because Pressa Halt had brought the documents from the Ashenvale Covenant's archive because those documents contained the fourth Triarch's own description of what a proper classification assessment for a Triarch required. And because those documents were 800 years old and constituted older precedent than anything Thresh could produce in opposition, the demonstration was reformatted. Kairen stood in the center of the chamber and let all three frequencies settle into their distributed positions. He had done this before, in training, under pressure, in various states of exhaustion and uncertainty. He had done it enough times that the architecture felt native now rather than constructed, something that had integrated rather than been imposed. He let the unified resonance build. The chamber temperature dropped approximately 3 degrees and then rose approximately 6. Every metallic object in the room, the documentation crystals, the assessor's recording equipment, the decorative brackets on the observation rails, began to vibrate at a frequency just below audible. The air took on the quality of the archival library at 2 in the morning, dense with potential, pressing gently at the edges of every surface. The pale green luminescence rose from his hands. The hot frequency ran through his legs and spine like current through a grounding rod, and in that state, with all three simultaneously present and distributed and stable, he held a compound vial in his right hand and synthesized. In approximately 30 seconds, a catalyst compound that would have required 3 separate practitioners in their respective fields, and a minimum of 4 hours to produce through conventional means. He set it on the floor. The compound emitted a pulse of light that interacted with the mana field already present in the room, and produced, briefly, a pattern on the chamber floor that 2 of the senior professors photographed for their research notes, and which Thresh's documentation crystals captured from 3 angles. He let the unified resonance subside. The chamber was quiet. Colvin Thresh looked at the pattern on the floor for a long time. He completed the procedural close of the assessment. His examiner's report, which he was legally required to file as written rather than verbal, stated, "Verification complete, classification confirmed, no grounds for contested status." He filed it, he collected his materials, he left. The procedural contested status was lifted. The classification was confirmed, uncontested, and entered into the Permanent Kingdom Registry of Aldenmore Awakened Citizens. 3 entries, side by side in a column that had never held more than 1 mind per person in 400 years of record. Primordial Berserker, Kairen Ashvael. Seventh-Reservoir Mage, Kairen Ashvael. Sovereign Alchemist, Kairen Ashvael. The Stormvale Mage Syndicate and the Redbrand Warrior Assembly both sent formal correspondence to the Academy the following morning. The Ashenvale Covenant sent a shorter and more personal letter directly to Kairen. The Iron Seal Compact sent nothing, which was either an acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond their reach, or the specific silence that precedes a shift in strategy. He was not certain which. He suspected that certainty would arrive in time. His father arrived at the Academy in person 2 days after the assessment, not officially, not with representatives or formal documentation. Just himself, traveling light, arriving at the front gate in road clothes with the particular posture of a man who has made a decision and is now living in the aftermath of it. They sat in the same small room, the one adjacent to the arena, the one that had seen several consequential conversations in the past few weeks. His father sat across from him and looked at him for a long time. He said, "I would like to understand, if you are willing to explain it, what you felt at those 3 ceremonies." Kairen explained, the locked door sensation, the city on the other side. The way reaching for it conventionally produced nothing but reaching for it in the archaic way from the basement archive produced that first faint response. His father listened without interrupting. When Kairen finished, his father was quiet for a moment. He said, "I should have gone further with the investigation after the second ceremony." Kairen said, "You had no reason to think the instrument was compromised." His father said, "I had a son who I knew was not empty. I felt it. I chose to doubt that feeling because the official record contradicted it." A pause. He said, "I would like to not make that specific mistake again." Kairen said, "Then trust that when I tell you what I am about to do next is the right direction, it is because I have thought about it very carefully and because I know what is inside me now." His father said, "What are you about to do next?" Kairen said, "Stay here for now. Finish training the architecture until it is fully stable under every condition I can produce. Work with Pressa Halt's historical documentation to build a methodology that can actually be written down, rather than reverse engineered from archived texts. Build something for the people who come after, if there are people who come after. His father said, and the Iron Seal Compact? Kairen said, becomes less urgent as the public record becomes more established. They suppressed me because I was unknown. A shadow. Being known is its own kind of protection. His father looked at him. He said, you figured a lot of this out alone in a library basement. Kairen said the library was very good. His father was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A real one. Not a diplomatic or social laugh, but a genuine one. The kind that takes you by surprise. It changed his face considerably. He said, your mother wants to see you. Kairen said, I know. Tell her I will be home at the mid-year break. His father said, Era is going to ask you approximately 40 questions. Kairen said, I know that too. His father stood. He crossed to Karen's side of the table and put his hand on his shoulder, briefly, and then released it. He left. Karen sat in the small room alone for a moment. Through the wall, he could hear the distant sound of the Academy's afternoon training sessions, the specific clatter and energy of hundreds of classified students working through their class drills in the halls above. He thought about the ranking board that used to be in the maintenance corridor. He thought about the gray stripe on the left sleeve of the unclassified uniform. He thought about what the unified resonance felt like when it was fully stable, and all three frequencies were running simultaneously in their proper distributed positions. The hot and the cold deep and the sharp chemical all present and informing each other and producing something that genuinely had no adequate name yet in any classification system that currently existed. He stood up. He had training to get back to. If you made it all the way through this story, I want you to know this is exactly the kind of content we live for on this channel. The misunderstood outsider who is not failing because he is weak, but because the system measuring him was never built to read someone like him. The slow build from a maintenance corridor ranking board to a kingdom-wide classified record that nobody had space for. The way each part of who he is, the barbarian blood, the mage reservoirs, the alchemist's eye, turns out to need the other two to be fully itself. That is what makes the story stick. If this one stayed with you, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find us. And if you want to be in the room when we cover the next one, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you actually see it when it drops. Drop in the comments, which of the three classes do you think is the most dangerous in Karen's hands? The raw barbarian power, the massive mana reservoirs, or the alchemist's ability to understand and manipulate everything he touches? I want to see the debate in there. See you in the next one.